Good morning, ladies. Am I on? Yep, okay. Boy, I tell you, breakfast after today is just going to be a big disappointment. That was great. All right, well, while you guys are getting more food and making your way back to your table, we'll go ahead and start. Today, I'm supposed to be talking about Isaiah chapters 12 through 22. And I will a little bit, but I really want to talk more big picture about prophetic literature in general because it is so unique. I don't know about the rest of you, but I found it took me a little bit to transition from wisdom literature in my thinking to prophetic literature because we read it with such a different lens. So I want to spend a few minutes this morning talking about what lens we put on and how we look at prophetic literature. So I hope that's okay with you guys. So let's start out just talking about some ideas of how do we read biblical prophetic literature? How do we read prophecy? So let's talk about a few things. Well, I know you guys get sick of hearing this, but I always say it's so important to know context. With prophecy, with prophetic literature, it is vital to know the context. Why is that? Because we have 17 prophetic books that were written during all different time periods in Israel's history. So, if you're going to read a prophet, wouldn't it be nice to know what time period and what was going on in the background when he prophesied? It would be kind of like if you could pick up a book on prophecies that were made about American history and you had no idea, was this Revolutionary War? Was this Civil War? Was this Vietnam era? Was this about pioneers that were expanding into the West? Wouldn't it be really helpful to know that? Because if you don't know that, then how are you going to make sense of what they're talking about, right? So please, 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 when you pick up a book of prophetic literature, take the time, discipline yourself to know what's the backdrop. And I'm sure I'm not quite following my notes, but we'll get there. So, how do we do this? How do we find out the context? Well, what's my favorite answer going to be? Study Bible. Okay, if you have a study Bible, hold it up in the air. All right. How many of you have a study Bible? Okay, hold it up, hold it up, hold it up. All right. All right, good. Yay. That makes me happy. That makes me happy. Now, what do we know about study Bibles? The study notes at the bottom are not the word. All right. The stuff at the top is the word. What is more important? The stuff at the top, the actual Bible. So the notes, yeah, yay. So the notes at the bottom, that's just one group of people's opinions about context or interpretation that apply. Now, not all study Bibles are created equal. Some of them I don't like at all. Some of them are wonderful. So if you find a good study Bible that really focuses on the context and the culture of what was going on at that time in history, that's the best kind of study Bible because that's what you're looking for. You're not looking for someone to tell you how to apply it all the time. Okay? So, study Bible. Discipline yourself when you start a new prophetic book to read the introduction in your study Bible and read everything you can get your hands on. If you can, go online and watch the Bible Project. They have a video for every single book of the Bible. They're like 8 minutes long and they're great overviews for the books of the Bible. So discipline yourself to do that. Don't just dive in and start reading because it would be like picking up a chapter in some book on American history and yet you have no idea where they are in American history. It just doesn't even make sense, right? Okay, use other resources like Bible dictionaries and Bible handbooks. And if you don't know where to find stuff and what's good, ask your small group leader or your mentor, and they'll be happy to help you with that. We've also, in your book, your notebook that we gave you when you registered for WOW, there's a page or two in there of resource materials that we recommend. Okay? Now, remember that prophetic books, as pretty much all books in the Bible, are not chronological, okay? In the West, we're taught to read things chronologically. Western authors, especially in this day and age, write chronologically. That's just logical, right? Well, in biblical times, that was not the norm. Okay, things were written thematically, not in time order, not in chronology, okay? So don't try to make it make sense chronologically, all right? You're just going to make it harder for yourself. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't understand, so I'm going to try to explain this clearly. Recognize with all prophetic literature, there are two types of prophecies. There's one that is called foretelling, and there is one that is called forth telling. So I want you to understand the difference, and I want you to think as you read in prophecies, what type of prophecy is this? Okay, let's start with foretelling. Foretelling is what we think of with fortune tellers. It's predicting the future. Okay, a lot of people mistakenly think that all prophetic literature is just this. It's foretelling, it's predicting the future. However, they are mistaken because the majority of biblical prophetic literature is more about forthtelling. And now, what is forthtelling? Forthtelling, in its simplest form, is speaking for God. It's just speaking for God, being a messenger for God. Now, we've seen a lot of messengers for God as we've read through the Old Testament, right? We've seen the priests, we've seen other prophets, we saw the judges, we saw kings that spoke for God. Again, this is the majority of prophetic literature, and I want to talk more about that. I've referred you guys very often to a resource book by Gordon Fee and something Stewart. I can't remember his first name. How to Read the Bible or How to Read the Bible Book by Book. Those two, which I do respect them as current day scholars, they refer to the Old Testament prophets as covenant enforcement mediators. Okay? I want you to think about that. Covenant. Now, how important is covenant in the Old Testament? Pretty important, very important, kind of important, way important. It's huge. We would say at all times, God is a covenant God. And I want to go into that a little bit more. Okay? So, before I move on to that, just to reiterate, foretelling and forthtelling, they're both valid parts of Scripture, right? But just keep in mind that when you're reading in this section of Scripture, most of what you're reading is men boldly, courageously speaking for God. They're not acting like genies in a bottle or fortune tellers, okay? Big difference. So I want to dig more into this whole covenant mediator thing. Now, some of you were with us when we went through the Pentateuch, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. I've listed 3 sets of chapters from the Pentateuch that have everything to do with being a covenant mediator. You'll see in your notes some scripture listed in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. For those of you that were with us when we did Deuteronomy, do you remember what the very end of Deuteronomy was? Like chapters 28 through 30? It's, spit it out, it's okay. Anybody? Yeah, it's blessing and cursing. So it's this reiteration. It had been spoken multiple times throughout the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, saying, if you keep my covenant, this is God, if you keep my covenant, you're going to enjoy these blessings. And it's a whole wonderful list of blessings. However, if you rebel and you don't keep my covenant, you're going to face this big, honking, terrible list of consequences, of bad consequences. And some people would argue that all forthtelling for God, speaking for God in our 17 prophetic books, stem from just these chapters, this reiteration of God's covenant. Sometimes in the Western church, we lose sight, we cut our tether to the law because we say, oh, it doesn't matter anymore. We're people of grace. Yes, we are people of grace. This is true, but the law does matter. God's covenant was birthed in the midst of his law being set forth. And so, therefore, when we see our prophets speaking in our 17 books, they're speaking right out of the basis of God's law that was originally laid out in the Pentateuch. It's pretty fascinating when you look at it. So, honestly, the majority of our prophetic books are nothing new. When they are speaking for God, they're not telling them anything new. They're probably just rephrasing it or adding some great imagery to help them get it, right? Some of you have a more creative mind, and if someone uses a word picture or puts something up on the screen that's just like big and artistic and colorful, it helps you grasp a concept, right? So that's what our prophets are doing. They use a lot of imagery, a lot of metaphors, a lot of allegories, but it all ties back to God's original law. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's interesting because when the prophets are speaking blessings for people that are keeping God's covenant and obeying God's covenant, they basically cover 6 general categories. And it's interesting if you watch, it's basically going to cover life. God promises us life, health, good health, prosperity, agricultural abundance, because that was an agrarian society, right? We didn't have still buildings built up and manufacturing companies back then. Respect for a man, especially in the ancient world. Respect today for all men is still really, really important, but it was far more so back then. Respect and safety. Now, when we think about what we've read in the Old Testament, do we see signs of God's blessing towards Israel, towards his chosen people throughout many eras in biblical history? Yeah. Do we even see it today, even with the craziness that's happening in the Middle East? Can you see God's divine hand intervening, divine safety? I see it all over the place. Okay. Now, there's the flip side of covenant, and that's what's going to happen if you choose to rebel against God and against his laws, or you choose to disobey. Interestingly, scripture primarily lays that out, especially if you go back to the earliest writings of God's covenant promises. The authors use 10 categories that all start with D's when it's translated into English. Okay. So if you're curious to know what those covenant warnings fall in, it's death, disease, drought, dearth, if you don't know what dearth means, it means a scarcity of food. That's the ancient use of the word. Danger, destruction, defeat, deportation, destitution, disgrace. Can you think of anything that you've read already in the Old Testament where we see description of all of these things happening to Israel? Yeah, it's very real. So when you're reading about these promises, these blessings, and these warnings, think back on what you've already read and see how it all ties together. Okay? To me, I think it's really, really fascinating because it could seem random, but this definitely ties into God's covenants. And that's exciting. Okay, now, what is the difference between God's prophets and a false prophet? You've just been dying to know that, haven't you? So let's talk about that because it's really important to know. So, false prophets usually spoke what their current king wanted to hear. So, they were very political. They were brown nosing. They were kissing up. They were being political, right? So, they were basically trying to save their own skin. And many false prophets actually, excuse the pun, they profited financially by being a false prophet and saying what the current king wanted to hear. Remember, this is mostly divided kingdom. Okay? So they were like modern day politicians. I hate to say that, but truly like a modern day politician that were very concerned with being PC. All right? False prophets were and are far more concerned with the fear of man than with the fear of God. So they cared way too much about what man thought about them and not so much about what God thought or God thinks. Now, in contrast, God's prophets, not false prophets, but truly a prophet of God, were very courageous men, very self-sacrificing. They knew when they took the job to be a prophet, a spokesman for God, they were going to be persecuted. Many were tortured, many were killed. This would be like signing up for the most top secret government job that you could possibly imagine, like the Secret Service of the FBI, of the Green Berets, of the Navy SEALs, like the top, the upper echelon. You understand what I'm saying? They they were signing up for something that they knew could very probably mean their death in a not very nice way. And they knew that it probably wasn't going to end well by worldly terms. Okay? Are you following me? So, to say, oh, I'm a prophet of God is not something that you would run around and go, I'm a prophet of God. Like, here, I'm a Secret Service man, just shoot me now. I mean, they wouldn't do that. They had to live in hiding a lot just to not be killed. They were hated by most of the kings. All right? So, are there examples of false prophets in America today? You think? What are some? Just throw it out there. What can you think of? Just throw it out there really loud. What? Dr. Fauci. Okay. Nothing political there. Can you think of any churches that would involve false prophecy? Mormonism, a cult. Okay. Jehovah's Witness. You can think of any number of cults where people deny scripture, right? They change scripture. Those would all fall in line with false prophets. Have you ever turned on your television and seen a television preacher or evangelism and they're saying, I hope I don't step on anybody's toes because I know a lot of us spent time in charismatic churches. I myself, I went to a charismatic Christian college. Imagine that. I spent a lot of time in a charismatic church, okay? So I'm not throwing charismatic churches under the bus. But sometimes you turn on the television and there's an evangelist on the screen saying, you, sir, stand up, the man in the gray suit. And the man in the gray suit stands up. You are going to be a millionaire and you are blah, 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 blah. And it's all about physical, selfish, self-centered, humanistic enrichment. Do we see any connection to God's covenant with that? Do you think that's true prophecy? No, that would be false prophecy. Now, I've been in churches with dear friends that I love dearly. We're human beings. Someone comes up for prayer. I lost another baby. I've never been able to have a baby. That was my own story for years and years and years. Dear friends of mine that love me dearly would lay hands on me and pray for me and say, "Oh, I'm seeing that God's going to give you 5 babies." That literally happened. God's going to give you 5 babies. Well, we were pregnant more than 5 times, but we never had a baby. So apparently that was a false prophecy. I mean, and I don't say that with bitterness in my heart, but I had to grow and mature to learn what is true prophecy of God and what is the emotion of man just trying to make us feel better, you know? So, my exhortation to all of us is be wise. Judge what you hear against scripture, not against a television evangelist. Okay? No matter who preaches or teaches from stage, everything that comes out of our mouths, you need to judge against scripture. Okay? Sorry, I know that was preachy. Okay. Forgive me. Okay. And I have to mention, I see tremendous, if you're watching the news right now, do you see a bit of deception going on American college campuses right now? Yeah, I'm telling you, there are false prophets. If you find out behind the scenes, there are people showing up at those collegiate protests that don't even go to the college, but they're looking for martyrs. Martyrs for what? You know, the 70 virgins when they die, you know? False prophecy is alive and well. We need to be wise. We need to be discerning. Okay. Oh my goodness. Woo, I am really behind. Okay. So my question, would you be willing to serve as an Old Testament prophet? Think about that. All right. Let's talk specifically about the book of Isaiah. As a review, remember the book of Isaiah is considered a Bible within the Bible because it's 66 chapters. And just as we have 39 books in the Old Testament, which reflects more of the law, the first 39 chapters of Isaiah is geared more towards the law. And the last 27 chapters of Isaiah, which would mirror somewhat the 27 books of the New Testament, is more about God's covenant and God's saving grace. Our author, Isaiah, is seen as the prince of all prophets. He was very well educated, probably came from a wealthy family, and he spoke and wrote beautifully. He's also called the Paul of the Old Testament. And as you read through Isaiah, think about Paul and the fieriness and the courage of Paul, and you might see Paul reflected in Isaiah. The book of Isaiah is to the Old Testament as Romans, the book of Romans, is in the New Testament. If you don't know much about Romans, Romans is called the Christian Manifesto. Romans is a hugely important book. I'm excited to get to Romans someday, but Romans is so important in the New Testament. So is Isaiah. So we really want to take your time. Now, it's really cool. The book of Isaiah is the most quoted Old Testament prophetic book in the New Testament. Just chapter 53 of Isaiah alone is quoted 85 times, quoted or alluded to 85 times by New Testament writers. So sit up and pay attention, okay? There's so much in here. I'm just going to have to jump through some things. All right. So specifically chapters 12 through 22. I'm going to try to really summarize this. Basically, what you need to know about this section that you're going to be reading this next week is it's really about God promising judgment to other nations. So what we just finished reading this week is all focused on Judah. Now in First Peter chapter 4, we're told judgment begins with the house of God. We see this in Isaiah. God's judgment has started with his own chosen people, with Judah. So now that he's laid out his judgment and his his arguments against his own people of Judah. Now he's going to turn to surrounding nations. And so each chapter that you're going to read about this week, with the exception of chapter 12, is really going to focus on different nations. And it's pretty interesting because you're going to see judgment, but you're also going to see God's willingness to forgive and to restore. And you're going to see that God is a God of the Gentiles as well as of the Jews. Okay? All right, so as we've seen throughout Old Testament history so far, what's the number one sin problem with the surrounding countries? Idol worship. Surprise. So guess what? You're going to continue to find out that idol worship does not make God happy. Never did, and never will. Okay? You're going to read about that a lot. And then you're going to find out that Babylon is talked about a lot. Babylon, you need to understand, is a symbol of all evil. And we find that evidentially in the book of Genesis, and we still see that evidentially when we get to Revelation at the very end. So understand that Babylon, although it was a physical empire that became very strong, in a biblical sense, Babylon represents so much more than that. Now, Babylon geographically today is Iraq, okay? But metaphorically, we have a lot of different thoughts about who Babylon is in today's world. Some people say it was the Roman Empire. Some people would say today it is Russia, it is China. Some people in the world say it is the US of A because we are so strong and so economically wealthy and spoiled and corrupt that we are Babylon. Things to think about. There's other ideas too. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do know that with absolute confidence, just as ancient Babylon was defeated, our modern day metaphorical Babylon will also be defeated. God has won. God will win. We know from Revelation that all evil is going to be destroyed. There's this nasty lake of fire that all evil is going to be thrown into. If you don't know about that, you can read Revelation chapters 19, 20, and 21 and read about how God is very unequivocally going to deal with all evil. And in the future heaven, future restored, glorified bodies in earth, there's not going to be any more pain, no more suffering, no more evil. It's all going to be dealt with. So we can read in confidence this week, knowing that no matter what we're reading about, God is going to deal with it. Okay? Thanks, ladies.